My name is Libby Witt. I am from the Office of State Support at the U.S. Department of Education. I'm a program officer for several states and currently the acting group leader for a larger group of states. I am not an assessment person. When Deborah asked me if I would monitor a panel for her, I told her I would only do it if she put me on a panel where I would actually understand what people were talking about, so not the validity panel. But this one I can do. We're here to do a second of two sessions where we are talking to several of our experienced peer reviewers about best practices in putting together state submissions for peer review. Before we get started, just for a gut check, how many of you in the room are the person at your state who's responsible for putting together an assessment peer review package? How many of you have never done this? How many of you have only done it once? Okay, that's what I figured. How many of you have done it more than once? Okay, not very many. This is the same thing that happened yesterday. We have 4 panelists here who have worked on our peer reviews in the last year, a couple of whom are also the person at their state agency who is responsible for doing this. Let me just do a brief introduction. We have here Heather Peltier. Heather is the Chief Assessment Officer for the Tennessee Department of Education. She previously worked in Florida with the Central Florida Assessment Collaborative and was the Secretary of the Florida Educational Research Association. Heather's going to go first in our discussion. She has a flight situation that she needs to cut out after only a few minutes, so we want to get her input and then move on. Our next panelist is, John Olson. John is the president of Olson Educational Measurement and Assessment Services and a senior partner for the Assessment Solutions Group. And he has more than 30 years of experience providing consulting on a variety of assessment and statistical related issues. And has worked with several states on their technical advisory committees. Next to John is Tracy Hembry. Tracy has psychometric expertise in both education and credentialing, where she's been working for over 10 years. She consults with clients on the design, development, and implementation of assessment programs, and has spent a lot of her career working on supporting large-scale student assessments for various types of student populations. And then on the end, we have Jeffrey Hauger, who is the Director of Assessments at the New Jersey Department of Education, where, as one of his delightful activities, he got to spend 3 hours yesterday with the State Board of Education telling them about assessment stuff, which sounds delightful. And he still managed to come. All right, so what we'd like to talk about today is best practices or ideas from the peer reviewers in terms of best practices for how you can put together your package of documents that you submit for assessment peer review in a way that's going to work for the peer reviewers, that's going to help them find what they're looking for, and just to give you a better sense of the kinds of things that they see when they work on these packages and when they're reviewing the 300 documents you've uploaded to OMB Max. When we were planning for this session, both this panel and the panel that talked about the same topic yesterday, we sort of came to kind of a two-part way of looking at this. The first being, what are things that states should consider in putting together their packages? And secondly, what are things that the peer reviewers wish that the states had done differently in putting together their packages, obviously related. But what I'd like to do is move to Heather. Now, Heather is one of our panelists who has some experience on both ends of this process, both as a peer reviewer and as a person who assembles a peer review package. So Heather, since you need to leave, I'm going to turn this over to you and let you talk.
Thank you very much. All right, so I just have a few things that I wanted to say about the process. And as Libby said, I'm coming at this from a peer reviewer perspective and from a state perspective. So because I've kind of seen both ends, I'm going to address it from that end. So first, I would say one of my biggest suggestions is to start the process early. And if possible, start as early as possible, even when you're in the test design and development stage. I know, many of you have already got assessments in place and you're locked in, but if it's at all possible, or if you've got a new standards adoption and you're going to be making some major changes, this is something to really take into consideration in those early stages, because so much of this just lays the groundwork for a really successful testing program within your state anyway. These are just really generally best practices in assessment development and administration. So the earlier to start, the better. Also because it's just such a heavy lift compiling all this evidence. So if you can compile it as you go, that's going to make the lift so much easier. That was not the experience that I had as a submitter. I actually kind of came to Tennessee and was told, hey, here's your project, and we've got like 2 months to get this together, and we've collected nothing so far. So I've kind of experienced it from both ends, and I can say I really wish that it had started earlier. The other really important piece is to assemble your team, because your team is going to be so key, having the right people working on this. You need people with measurement background, with technology background, content, your policy people, because some of the standard adoptions and communication pieces. And then, of course, your assessment team and your vendor is such a key piece. Our vendor was just such an important, played such an important role in the submission. Some of the components, this goes back to this starting early. Some of the components like cognitive labs, if you plan to include those are best done early in the process. So again, just making sure that you take this peer review submission into consideration as you're planning. And then in terms of the actual organization and the submission itself, coming at this from a peer perspective, it's really helpful if you organize your evidence and in a way that that is going to be clear and make sense. So peers might have some personal differences in terms of what they prefer for organization, but as long as it's clear, that's a really key piece. So for example, I like it if there's a naming convention that might include the indicator, and then I've heard other peers say they don't really like that because there are some pieces that would overlap. To me, as long as, whatever you do, as long as it's clear and organized. I really like the naming criteria, including the indicator, because try as you will, I have yet to see a submission that doesn't have maybe one piece of evidence that gets omitted inadvertently from your narrative, and then it's hard for us to figure out where exactly it's supposed to go unless it's evident in there. Like if it's piece number 13, I don't really know. Whereas if it's piece 2.1.17, I know I need to look at this for critical element 2.1, for example. But that's a pure personal preferencing. So there may be others on the panel that would disagree or like it organized differently. In terms of links to websites, generally that's best to avoid because the links will change and then we end up with a broken link. So it's better if you can do screen captures. If you do include links, we'll do our best to go to them and hopefully they're working. I think the worst I've seen is someone who just linked to the home page and said, go find this document. And I tried really hard. I think I spent about 20 minutes and said, I can't. I have no idea where this document is. So don't do that. But if you can just include the document or have it even screen captured if it's something that isn't an actual document itself, but you want to show me something that's present on the website, screenshots are better, and that way it completely avoids that. Page numbers are really big. And then going back to working with your vendor, if you are doing an RFP for a new vendor, if any of these criteria that are most appropriate for vendor involvement, if you can include in that RFP, I think that would be extremely helpful. Just because that way the expectation is clear from the beginning that's a partnership between you and the vendor and they have some joint responsibility in your successful submission. And I'm so sorry to be disruptive and leave early. I apologize.
The plane
Good
is
luck.
good. We hope. Okay, can you get out?
I've got it.
All right. All right. I'd like to then, Jeff, since you're the other person on this panel who's coming at this from both directions, can you talk a little bit about what you learned from being a peer reviewer about how you might go about putting together a submission the next time you do it?
Yeah, it's funny because being on the other side, you see all the mistakes that you made on the side when you submit it. And so for those states that have not been part of the peer review process, I would highly recommend doing it. I think it's a very good learning experience. And I think it will just enhance your peer review when you submit. I've learned a lot. Looking around just the country and, in this room, test directors right now, I'm going on my 8th year, but I think I'm one of the older ones in terms of years of service and being director of assessment. Majority, I think, are 1 to 3 years. And I just bring up this point because when you're going through the peer review process, I remember the first time I did it, you're looking at this, you're going, what am I doing? How can I do this? I think it's very important to reach out to other states and to sort of build a network. For me, I learned that once I started working in consortiums. We worked with the Park Consortium, and that really educated me on many different topics. And I think just those conversations about policies, how they're doing things, really helped me out. And so I know the assessment world is sort of going tribal now. Every state is sort of doing their own thing. But I still think those connections between states, and particularly those at the beginning, I think is very important. And from my experience, states are very willing to work with other states in providing information and understanding. Because, one of the things is, the expectation to know exactly what that critical element states. And, sometimes it can be confusing. I think, and that's sort of my major point here is I don't think states use the state comment section on the peer review as well as they could. And I said this earlier, but I think, if you provide a narrative of the information you're talking about and what are you providing and really hitting that this will be, critical elements and, this page or this report and really spelled out and create a story, I think it helps not only the peer reviewers find the material, because, more is definitely not better. It's really like us trying to really figure out exactly how you meet this critical element. That's what we really care about. But I think if you tell that story, it really puts into perspective, the stuff that you have submitted. And like was said earlier, like the validity aspect of the peer review process. There's a lot of things that if you have the luxury of building this into an RFP, I think that's preferable, like what Heather was saying. But, some of us are in mid-contracts, and that's, not possible. And I think the studies that you can do and the evidence that you provide is a little bit different if it's pre-baked into a contract or if you're 2 years, 3 years in and you're trying to provide evidence. And I think, those kind of comments and evidence of, I think there's different ways to provide some of that validity evidence. But, if you describe that, I think that becomes more contextual for us to review, and it makes, more sense. I do state, though, I will say that be proactive in the state narrative. This is something I learned by seeing a state do this. And what I mean by that is, I hope when you submit the stuff, where your weaknesses are. And so I think if you explain that to the peers, and even if the example this morning was like an alignment study. If you know that some test is a little bit weak, and you are saying, look, we know this, we're submitting this, and here's a timeline to get on it. I think that's a totally different view than if you're just trying to hide it. Or you don't talk about it, because then you're forcing us to we assume that you think that this covers it, and then we're saying, no, this falls way short. But if you tell us that that it's going to fall short, and this is your plan to correct it, I think that puts a different perspective on the review.
Okay, thank you. This is a question for both John and Tammy. One of the things that Jeff just raised is this idea of explaining your evidence using that column of the index to do it. What is your feeling as an experienced reviewer about how much explanation are you looking for? How much is too much? How much is not enough? Is there a sweet spot that folks should be aiming for?
Tracy, you can go first. Thanks. So I've heard this exact question in speaking with various states while I've been here. I think it's a great question, and I'm going to take the psychometrician answer, which is it depends.
That's also the Department of Education answer, just in case you were wondering.
I have a colleague who charges $1 every time a psychometrician at work says it depends. So
She's rich.
anyway, exactly. No, but I do think this is important in that, as Jeff mentioned, I think the narrative can be a great tool for you in your submission. So there are some critical elements where you're going to supply evidence, and it's straightforward, the connection between the evidence that you are supplying and the critical element. And so in those cases, it wouldn't need to be extensive narrative. Point the peer reviewers to the right place. No need to spend your time writing additional narrative. But then there are other cases, and the alignment study is a good example. Or if you have an adaptive assessment and not every student received an assessment that met the blueprint exactly, things of that nature. If you don't provide a narrative, you're leaving your peer reviewers to assume that you think it's okay what you've submitted. And the expectation is not perfection across the board, because those of us who are on these peer review panels are either at a state currently developing our own assessments, have been at a vendor. We've all been there. And so it's just about saying, here's what we've learned, and here's how we're utilizing that information moving forward. Here's how we're going to take that into account and address this moving forward. And so I think those are the places where you're going to need your narrative to point those out. And then I'm trying to think of a couple other places where the narrative can be helpful and maybe more lengthy. So if you have to, if best practice tends to dictate that you do things a certain way, but for whatever reason that didn't work for your assessment at the time, that's a place where you're going to want to provide a narrative to say, we wanted to do it this way, here's why we couldn't, and here's what we did instead. Because then you're at least kind of providing the peer reviewers with more insight, since we weren't there with you when those decisions were made. So those are the places where I would recommend a little bit more information in your narrative. You do not need to restate what is already in, for example, your technical manual. So you don't need to provide narrative that, for 3 pages that covers what's already within the reliability chapter. So, don't make extra work for yourselves. But if it's not already covered in what you're supplying, that's where the narrative can be helpful.
I think I'm good here. All right, can you hear me? So I've been on both sides of the fence here too, except that I haven't really sat in the seat that either Heather or Jeff or many of you state assessment directors have, which is actually having to do this task. I've been on the receiving end and I've been on the advising front end. And the advising front end, it's probably the easiest one. It's like, okay, give some advice to the state on what they need to be doing. If there's certain pieces that seem to be lacking, provide some hopefully constructive advice so the state gets towards having those pieces of evidence. And then I've also been sitting with TACs, and I'm amazed at how often peer review related stuff comes up at TAC meetings now. Back in the old days, maybe a little here or a little there. Recently, it's almost a topic at every TAC meeting, and increasingly more TACs are being asked to kind of weigh in on evidence before it's actually included and submitted. So anyway, because I've been on both sides, but I haven't done this thing, and because the topic of our session is best practices in assembling peer review submissions, I thought if I had to do this, if I was the state assessment director of state X, how would I approach this? And I thought, well, a model or a framework might be, think about when you had to do your doctoral dissertation. It's a planning event. You don't just all of a sudden say, oh, I'm going to do this, and I know a general topic, and get a bunch of information, throw it together, and shoot it off to your advisory team. You have to think it through. So I kind of laid out a plan, a framework for your consideration, states, and Jeff, my co-panelist, and see what you think. But if you use the dissertation approach, certainly start off with a plan and all that, and think about a plan that is at least a 12-month plan to begin preparing. You heard what Heather had to say, start early. So the very first step would be sort of make your outline of what you're going to do, what you're going to need, what kind of team you need to assemble to go through the 30 critical elements, the 6 or 7 sections of the peer review guide, depending on if you want to do a locally selected high school, nationally representative high school assessment too, then you've got a little more work to do, actually a lot more work, but so get that outline, kind of put your plan together in place, and it should be a team effort, not just you, the assessment director, having to do it all. And then I would call the next section of your dissertation the lit review. Okay, now take a look at all your existing documents that you have in the state, everything that you think makes sense, that would be good evidence for that meet these various critical elements. Go through that, identify any missing things that you're going to have to go, okay, now how do I get this? Third part, the methodology would be, so get those documents and start building your file, electronic file, since it's going to be electronic submission. Get documents from your vendor, make sure that you've got all that information, and you look at it too. If you find that some evidence doesn't exist, then either if it's the vendors can help you with that, then have them help put it together. Another reason to start early, especially in things like validity evidence. I mean, that's time-intensive activity, let's just say, to get your validity evidence together for elements 3.1 through 3.4. So, there might be some research involved on it. Anyway, so get everything, sort through it all. Again, make sure that you've got everything and it is sufficient. Then, probably the fourth section of a dissertation is kind of look at other things like so-called findings, data. If you have data that needs to be analyzed, well, get that done, typically with your vendor. If you have data you want to submit, well, make sure it's the right data and it's understandable to the user. In this case, the user is going to be a peer reviewer like us. We don't know what to do with a whole bunch of data unless you kind of explain what's going on with it and how that data supports the critical element evidence that you need. Then finally, you've done all these things, the summary or conclusions chapter of your dissertation. For the peer review submission, it's basically put it all together, following the peer review guide, its structure, section 1, 1.1, 1.2, on and on through there. Organize it that way. Use the index template that's part of the system, and so that you actually are feeding the stuff in a organized, how many times have we said organized, but in a way that really makes sense and the peer reviewer can follow through step by step. Put your annotations in there, any comments, narrative. As Tracy was saying, that's an important part. A lot of times when I'm a peer reviewer, I'm looking at that first, like trying to make heads or tails of what is all this stuff, and start digging into it. So I think that's extremely important. And then, of course, enter all this. Part of this process would be you'd probably be entering it into the Fed's secure site. I'd always forget the name of it. Max?
Yeah.
Everybody loves Max, so it's secure. That's what I know. And I'm on the receiving end of it. I haven't ever had to go in and put stuff in. But the more you're organized ahead of time, it should be a straightforward flow going into it with all the other stuff. Enter it in, push the button, and you're done. Easy.
Anything you want to add to that? So write your
Did I miss an important step? And buy extra Motrin, Tylenol, and maybe some wine for after hours.
Yeah. No, I mean, it seems like one of the sort of things that all three of you have kind of said in different ways is that it's really important to make sure that you're demonstrating how your evidence illustrates that you've successfully met the critical element. And it sounds like all of this sort of feeds into it. Do you have the right evidence? Have you provided the correct level of explanation to show, like with data runs, how are you analyzing this data that you're presenting as evidence to make sure that the data actually does what that you're sort of guiding the peer reviewers towards how you want them to interpret this or how you interpreted this, and then making sure that it's organized in a way that they can actually find it and associate it with the right bits. Just on the OMB Max thing, for those of you who haven't done this, you'll get a Max password. Don't wait until the last minute to check and see if your password works. We've had some issues with that. So as soon as somebody sends you an email with the password, test it out, make sure you can get into the system. Also keep in mind that for each round of peer review, everybody has the same due date by which all the stuff needs to be submitted. And if all of you are trying to submit all of your stuff into Max, uploading your 300 documents all at the same time, the system will not be your friend. So just, be aware of that. And again, that's another place where starting early is probably a good idea. Yeah.
Add one thing. Every once in a while, we see, I've seen that where, it's a pretty good submission by state, but they leave out a critical element or two. And I think sometimes it's really important to focus on the left column that says critical elements, because I think sometimes people look at that middle column, the examples, and that they use that as the guideline of information to send. And I think that can lead sometimes to missing a critical element or not referring to it or not providing evidence, because you're really looking at trying to follow the examples that were given rather than really understanding what the critical elements are, because that's what we use. I mean, we don't look at the examples. We're really focused on that left. So the examples are good to give us, guidance on things that we can use, but I think sometimes people follow them really closely, and I think they sort of lose what the overall purpose is, and that's really to fill out the left column of the critical elements.
And I'll just add to that on several panels that I've been on, a common issue is that a state will really hit hard on a particular element. I don't know, if I just pick one, 3.1 may require several pieces of evidence. And if you read that left column, there are several things that are required within an individual critical element. And you may hit home really hard on one of them and then kind of forget the last one or something else in there. So be sure that you're reading them really thoroughly and submitting evidence that relates to all of the requirements within each critical element. Because I know that that's something we've seen on panels, is that a state is great on this one piece of it, but kind of left out any evidence related to something else.
That many of the critical elements have subparts, and
Yeah.
you need to be sure you hit all the subparts.
Yep.
And kind of related to that is certainly missing a critical element is not a good thing. Your peer reviewers are going to ding the state on that. But there's, on the other side of it, is too much info, the TMI factor, or what I've seen in some peer review submissions, the fluff factor, meaning like there's all this stuff and then there's this other stuff, and like, how is this even relevant to the critical element? It's like, I'm not sure what happened there. But sometimes there's things in there, and I'd sit and look at my fellow peer reviewers and go, how do you interpret this? Does this mean anything? Everybody's scratching their heads, and it's like, no. So we wasted some time trying to figure out what's going on there. Now, I think it's important to put all the information you can in there, but it's probably good to have internally in your office a second read or something that would say, okay, is this really important? If it's just fluff, like extra stuff referred to in a tech report or other stuff that came in from your vendor, but it really isn't addressing the key thing, well, please don't put that in there.
Yeah, because I think, the key there is we may be going down rabbit holes and not focusing on the information that you do have. And so, usually when submissions happen, we have hundreds of pages to review and look at. And, I think the most efficient process is, if you look at the validity aspects in the reliability, a lot of that's in your, technical manual. But you don't need to submit like 10 technical manuals, right? You can submit just one technical manual and just really focus in on the page numbers and the sections that we should be looking at. One state, which I thought was, an interesting idea, and I think it probably helps them with peer review, is that they've sort of organized their technical manual sort of like the peer review is organized. And so then they can sort of have a checklist to make sure that their technical manual is hitting the pieces that are required for peer review. And so, like I said, if you're in between contracts, perhaps you can do that. I don't know, could be a scope change. But I think, definitely if you're looking to have a new contract soon, trying to get some of these elements in the contract at the start will really be helpful for you and your vendor.
I thought it might be helpful to share kind of the tone, at least in my experience, on the peer review panels that I've been on. I think if you are submitting all of these materials and sitting there waiting for a response, you probably have, you have no insight into what's going on. And so at least on the panels that I've been on, the panel wants the state to be successful. And so we are looking for, in the evidence, ways in which we can say that you have met the requirements as they're listed in the critical elements. So I have been on panels where we have said, here's what they submitted for this critical element. That seems irrelevant, but we did see something that we think fits in this other part that the state didn't point out. And so we'll put in the notes section, this document, not so much, but here's where we think you may have hit it. And trying to give feedback as much as we can to be productive, and also keep in mind that, some of these things are really hard to accomplish. So anyway, just the tone, at least in my experience of these panels.
And my experience as monitoring the panels is very much in that same line. They want to say yes on the critical elements. And actually, something that one of the panelists in the first session said that I think bears repeating, and this goes to John's point about submitting the fluff or the stuff that maybe is only tangentially related. If the peer reviewer can't find something, even if you submitted it, but you've submitted so much they can't dig through it, they can't recommend that you've met the critical element. They have to actually be able to find it. So that's where making sure that it's clear how the document fits the critical element, if it's a 300-page technical manual and there's 2 pages of it that are relevant to this particular point, be sure you let them know what page they're supposed to be looking on, because otherwise they're going to try and read the whole 300-page thing and they may give up before they get to that spot. So it's really important. They really like page numbers. They really like an organized index. Those are like the best things. And it's a source of irritation when those things aren't there. One question that had come up in another panel, many of the peer reviews that we're conducting now are sort of re-reviews of, the state brings their assessment in for the big review, and they've made the grade on half the critical elements, but they have to come back on the other half. So on the re-reviews, the peer reviewers are looking at a much smaller subset of documents. And sometimes you may be looking at only one of the state assessments, not the entire system. How much context about the state assessment system is helpful? Is that something you need to know? Is that something that the state folks, need to talk about at all? Or is that something that's just completely extraneous?
Well, I think, there's part of it, I think there's a trust factor that the peer reviews, like all the previous information, is good, so focus on this part. But I would just go back to what, the state explaining, right, and just putting stuff into context. I think I've been on one of those where it was a re-review, and so the way I viewed it, I was just really focused on okay, what, the notes from the previous one of what information they had to do, and then what they had. So I'm just really focusing on this one, and, all the other stuff or whatever happened. I just want to make sure that the notes or whatever came out of the peer review and the information are aligned, and so they can meet it. And if there's some explanation from the state, and that that goes back to the explanation from the state, right? I mean, we are looking for stuff to try to help states out, and if you proactively tell us certain things or guide us, I mean, I think that helps us to help you and eventually get through the system. But to that, I'm just looking at that particular area, and so I don't really need a lot of background, because I think I look at the notes that were to the state and the evidence submitted. I don't know.
And I've been fortunate in that in resubmissions, we have been able to reconvene the same panel. So we all got back together and said, went back to our notes from the last time we looked at the state's information, and we're like, oh yeah, that's right, here was this thing. So we, at least in that situation, and I know that's not always possible, we had the context.
Yeah, I know when Don and Deborah are setting up the panels, they try whenever possible to do that. Sometimes it doesn't work just from a strictly logistical standpoint, but they do try, if the same assessment is being re-reviewed, to reassemble at least some of the same panel if they can't do the whole thing.
So, my experience in this was last year I had 2 different states. One of them was part new and part resubmission, and let me just give you context from a peer reviewer's standpoint. There's a heck of a lot of materials that are sent, and Jeff said hundreds of pages. It's more like thousands of pages of stuff you have to look at. Typically 300 or more documents, and each document can be quite a few pages. So when I looked at the state's resubmission, I'd looked at all the new stuff, and I was looking at that too and going, does this mean I have to look at all the peer review stuff from the previous time it was submitted? There's a lot there, and no, I kind of just focused in, like Jeff was saying, on, okay, what's this new evidence that's being resubmitted? And when I showed up to meet with my panel, luckily the other 2 people on my panel had reviewed the state before, so I relied on their context to kind of say, okay, what led to this and the decision the peer group made the year before, and now is this evidence really meeting what we need? So that helped. If it was all new people on a state, that would be a challenge, let's say.
So it might be useful to provide at least a little bit of context, just in case you've got a peer reviewer who wasn't on the panel.
Yes, that would help a lot.
One of the things that has come up in a number of, in our planning discussion and in the panel yesterday, was the importance of making it clear through the documents that you provide that you as the state understand the critical element. What are some tips that you might be able to give states on either making sure they actually do understand the critical element, or on demonstrating that they do?
Well, I think looking at the peer review submissions, I think states are successful when they have information of showing, for instance, like, let's go to test security. That they have the proactive measures before the assessment, and that's where, like, a lot of that sort of stopped, right? Saying, okay, well, here we have our policies, our procedures, here's our training, boom. But that's not really what's asked for. What peer reviewers are looking for is what's the next steps afterwards? How was that implemented? And I think you could say that for a lot of the documentation. I think states do a pretty good job of that first step, but then having actually, looking at that evidence to ensure that that first step, I call it the second step, was actually, useful or helpful, or, what you did, like, okay, you found a test breach. What happened from there? And did you implement it? I think that's something that sometimes states, struggle with. But in terms of understanding what the critical elements are. I still go back. I mean, I think there's a lot of resources. Dawn is great at getting back and asking questions, but for a state with my experience, I would reach out to other states. And I think I don't know if replicating is the right word, but at least seeing, okay, well, this state was successful on these critical elements. Let's look to see what they submitted and what they did, and then you could have a conversation with states. I think that for a state would be probably the most helpful thing, just to understand, A, do they understand what the critical element's asking, and B, the information that I think I'm going to submit, is that what successful states who pass that element have done as well.
I want to build on Jeff's example about training. So there are various places where training is required, through administration of various policies. And so I know it's come up on several peer review panels where the evidence submitted is the state conducted training, here are our slides, and here are the dates on which we offered this training. Fantastic. What evidence do you have that anyone attended? So again, it's kind of taking the next step. And so, what evidence do you have that people actually received the training that you offered? So those tend to be some of the missing pieces that I've experienced, at least on the panels. So it doesn't have to be anything extensive. It could be attendance counts, and here's how many test administrators we have in the state, and we've had this many attend training to demonstrate that. We've also had, attestations that people have completed training if it's self-guided, making sure that you're counting how many attestations you have versus how many you expected to have.
So, this is a good question here, and I was looking at it in a way of understanding what the critical element is requiring is definitely an important thing from the state perspective, but also being able to take a step back and looking at what evidence you have and saying, is this really sufficient for providing that evidence that the state is addressing this requirement? And so those of you who have been following peer review, and I've been following it since 1999, when I was first trained to be a peer reviewer, seems like a long time ago, and it was. But anyway, things have changed a lot in recent years. Just look at what states are are being shown that they don't have enough evidence on, or not meeting requirements or partially meeting them. The areas of monitoring. We were just at a session an hour ago on monitoring and what does that really mean, and not every state had the same perspective on what does this mean that's required here. Monitoring means monitoring, being there in the schools and watching test administrations. So you've got to have evidence that sufficiently shows that you're meeting that. Jeff mentioned test security. Yesterday I did address the test security issue in one of these sessions. So just watch the video if you want some tips. But if you want to go right to the source, I looked very closely at those, at all of the examples of evidence that are in the peer review guide, and I drew upon those, as well as some work resources like TILSA-SCAS and the test security guidebook that was shared with states. You have that type stuff. You address those issues on what you're doing. Alignment used to be a big issue with state peer reviews. It seems to have gotten better, but I personally am working with a state right now who has to resubmit peer review evidence because their alignment study failed the big test. It was not an independent alignment study. It was done by their vendor who develops their test. Well, that's not right. And so they've got to redo it. And so anyway, that one shouldn't be such a big problem. Validity, though, is an ongoing issue. States are always needing more evidence in validity, and there's the 4 parts of validity, too. All I can say on that is get what you can, work with your vendor, and have a plan, It may be a long-term plan that how to get all the validity evidence that you need, and submit the plan as part of peer review. If the plan is in process, okay, that's fine. On ATACA, I advise the state, okay, come up with a multi-year plan and start showing progress toward meeting that. Of course, get your vendor to start delivering on the various validity studies, and that will be a helpful piece of evidence for peer reviewers. I have a question. So there's a new critical element, 1.5, perfect timing here too. This is where you this is where you pan the camera over to Don. So when you're talking about evidence, and this one here is like, it's a new one. It's the new 1.5 on meaningful collaboration, consultation. And I'm waiting to see what evidence will be on meaningful and see what my peer reviewer peers say. Is this meaningful? It's going to be an interesting conversation. But, I think y'all know what the intent of it is. So that one is a TBD on the amount of evidence that's needed and if it is indeed sufficient.
I think on that one, you might want to, as a preliminary step, talk to the people at your agency who are responsible for submitting the state's plan under ESSA, because that was also something they had to do for the state plan, and Dawn is nodding, so clearly that was the right answer. But that might be a good place to start of, what kind of stuff did you do, what kind of evidence did you need to submit, that sort of thing. So, I think that what I'd like to do now is, we've got about 25 minutes left, but I'd like to open it up for questions. Is there anybody in the room who has something they want to ask of these experienced panels? There's a microphone there, kind of behind the post. We won't be able to see you, but you can. The room's not that big. You can also yell. But does anybody have a question they want to ask? Yes.
John, you had mentioned that a peer review panel typically goes over 300 documents. Would that include the general assessment, the alternate assessment, the science assessment, or are you suggesting that we're spending a lot of fluff in 300 documents, or is that appropriate?
I'm really not sure what's appropriate. Some states just have more documents than others. Some states, especially if the program's been around a long time, they've got all sorts of assessment-related things, and they draw upon it, and it's probably good things to do. I don't know, that'd be an interesting study, like what is the, somebody counted just the number of pieces of evidence that are submitted by states and look at it. All I know is when I was looking at it, it was between 200 to 300 or 400. It's definitely better than, what's that?
Per assessment?
No, the entire package that would be.
Alt and science.
Right. Sometimes alt isn't in it. Sometimes it is. What was I going to say? It's definitely better with the way the system works now, though, than how it worked in the old days, which was load up the boxes full of evidence and materials and ship them to either Washington, D.C., or however they got into the peer reviewers' hands. And wow, I'm glad I wasn't a peer reviewer then. So,
Yeah, the documents, though, I think looking at all the critical elements and stuff, just talking from a state perspective, the information usually resides in a lot of different places. So, you may have to, give it one booklet that's 100 pages, and you're only using 1 or 2 pages of that for, one of the critical elements. So, I think it's pretty extensive, but the way that the assessment office operates is that the documents can be spread into many different documents. Sometimes they're memos and such. So it's not really how many documents, and the key really is to focus us on where that important piece is to meet that critical element.
That actually, though, his question raises an interesting question in that many of the peer reviews, you are looking at multiple assessments. Sometimes it may only be one, but sometimes how should, or what's your preference, or do you have a preference on how people organize so it's clear what document goes with what assessment? I mean, is there a way that makes it easier to manage that when you're maybe looking at 4 or 5 assessments in a single peer review?
Well, typically what I've seen is states have been pretty good of saying, this is our general assessment. These are the documents for this, and organize it that way. And that's made it easier. As a peer reviewer, for me, it's easier to do. I like to go through each assessment individually instead of trying to do all of them for
Critical element 1.1 for
and
1,
do,
2, 3,
yeah,
4,
do it
5, critical
across.
element 1, 2, okay.
The programs are different. I think I'm looking for different things, and so I think I think it's just easier for me to organize and just go through one like general assessment, and then I'll hit the alternative to science.
I agree with that.
Yes.
Looks like the microphone's not working. So, I know you didn't touch base on meaningful consultation, but I am going to kind of go down this path because I kind of want to hear it. We are looking at English language proficiency assessment and alternate English language proficiency assessment. Therefore, some of our stakeholders will be parents who are limited English proficient. What will be the expectation from the reviewers of having materials for stakeholder engagement consultation in languages parents can understand?
Do we have anything yet, or is that to be determined?
I think it's to be determined, but number one, someone that has the guidance I know can check, but I do think that 1.5 is designated as an ed review item, not a peer reviewer item. There's certain items that are set aside to be basically reviewed by our staff, which it's because they generally are a little more statutory in nature or administrative in nature.
It is.
Don't require such professional judgment, so that peer reviewers would bring. So I think, which means the department has some discretion in figuring that out. And so, that's not gonna help me, thank you. I think we will have to consider a question like that in terms of, what accessibility do various stakeholder groups have, if that helps. I mean, I think we will be reasonable in considering that kind of requirement, right? So that's just my instinct.
So I'm coming from the L side, program side of the house. It helps me to kind of know in advance because my assessment team is going to ask me what kind of supports do they need for those stakeholder engagements, so we can be proactive in planning for that discussion.
So the other distinction on 1.5 that I came in late, so is that there's a timeline on that one. If you have, for instance, ELP standards that your state adopted in 2011, that requirement doesn't apply. It's in the guide.
So it'd be new ones that are
It's a
happening.
new requirement, so it only takes effect to any standards adopted after the time of the passage of ESSA, so. I
Which
wanna
was-
say it's December 2015.
That's it, December 2015.
But it will also apply to all the alternate standards that states will be adopting.
No,
Alternate.
no,
standard.
because the requirement is on the adoption of the content standards or the ELD standards, right? Not the achievement standards, or in the case of the alternate, you don't really develop, statutorily, those tests are aligned with the ELD standards, not alternate ones, the ELD standards, but they are typically assessed, or the achievement level is much less complex and is different. Am I making sense? I can compare this to the academic standards, because that's where we have a history. Statutory requirement is state must adopt academic content standards. The alternate assessments are aligned with those academic standards, and many states use extended standards to design there's no requirement that those extended standards be adopted by a state. It's the academic content standards and the alternate achievement standards. Okay, so the extensions kind of help bridge that gap. Am I making sense? So that helps.
Any other questions? Now's your chance. I think this is the last session of 2 days of intensive assessment peer review discussion, and you probably all lost the will to live by this point. Or you're worried that it's gonna rain and rain out your flights. So I think if people don't have any other questions, we'll wrap this up. I would just as a summary, organization is important, labeling is important, page numbers are important. Make sure that you do the explanatory bit where you explain how the evidence meets the critical element, but not too much. Yes.
So I thought of one thing
Yeah.
that when Jeff and Tracy and John were just talking just now about looking at a test all by itself, some states prefer to create their index for that test. Then they create,
Get a
you already
second
say
index
this?
for the-
No,
Well,
but-
no, but
So then create an index for the other test.
Yeah.
And sometimes there's 3 tests in the review.
Right.
So you'd have a 3rd index. And I do think reviewers appreciate being able to go through somewhat linearly in
Yeah.
that fashion.
Yeah, and I would say, based on the discussion today, but also the discussion at the other panel that we did on this yesterday, one of the things about just the really basic labeling and index stuff is, for those of you who are putting these things together, you know what you're talking about. And you know how things get when you're compiling something where you know what you're talking about. That doesn't necessarily mean that somebody who isn't you is gonna know what you're talking about. I would really strongly suggest that you get somebody else at your agency, preferably somebody who isn't in your assessment office, to look at your index and your organizing thing and say, does this make sense to you? Could you find this stuff? The way you've labeled, the way you've set up your index. Because if that person who's reasonably knowledgeable about education can't figure out how this thing hangs together, it probably doesn't. And so that might be a way before you submit, just to get another set of eyes on it to make sure that you can find things. Because my experience of monitoring the panels is that's one of the biggest frustrations is, I think maybe this is in here somewhere, but I can't find it. And then they have to say, I'm sorry, you didn't meet the critical element. And, like I said, if they can't find it, they can't recommend that you.
And I just want to, you triggered something that, so for states that are part of a common assessment or consortium submission, so what we recommend is the consortium says in its submission, here's our evidence, and they only include the critical elements they're addressing. Or if they're addressing it partially, they say, this is partial, the state's going to add some stuff. And then we advise the states that are supporting that to say, for say critical element 3.1, see consortium submission. We're not giving you anything. Okay? That's a really good, efficient pattern because then reviewers know where to look or what to refer to. What some states have done is because they think it will be helpful, they repeat the evidence that the consortium has already submitted, and they sort of double down in their index, and they repeat all that evidence again. Which, number one, is confusing to reviewers who have already perhaps sat on the consortium panel, or more importantly, it's annoying to the reviewers because they've already read all this stuff, and they really don't want to have to sift through it. So that's just a thought that, to have the things fit together, but not repeat each other.
Most of you have probably participated in a review of something, whether it's peer review or, looking at grant proposals for competition. Rule 1, don't annoy the reviewer. It doesn't help in the long run. Right, well, thank you so much for coming. We really appreciate it. And thank you to the panel for your insights.